Well, good afternoon, and thanks for coming to learn about UAM. This afternoon, the way we're going to handle this is we're going to go through right now, and they're going to let each of the speakers introduce themselves. Then we're going to come back, and we're going to start with Jay, and Jay's going to run through some information, and then we're going to go back through that and provide information to you, kind of like setting the playing field. And then we're going to take questions, some that have come in prior to today's event, and then anybody in the audience want to ask any of the experts as we go through this, and you find out what area they are experts in. So over to you, Jay.
Thank you, Jim. Good afternoon. I'm Jay Merkel. I'm the Executive Director of the UAS Integration Office at the FAA.
Hi there. My name is Nikhil Goyal. I'm the co-founder and head of product for Uber Elevate.
Hello, Travis Mason from Airbus, leading our urban air mobility policy and certification team.
Hi, I'm Kerry Cannon. I'm the Chief Engineer of Innovation at Bell.
Hi, I'm Michael Diamond. I'm with Nexa Capital. We are infrastructure-oriented investors.
Wow, so there you have it. We've got a list of expertise that covers a lot of the areas. Basically, innovators is what I heard as I went down from Jay on down. So with that, we're going to have each one is going to present a little bit specifically more detail on what they're bringing to the table here. Jay.
Thank you, Jim. If I could have the first slide. Is it up? No? Okay. So this is our UAS integration strategy, and it really embodies our approach independent of the size of the aircraft. I was talking with Jim just before the panel. In fact, you remind me of a regulator I used to work with.
Wait, did you offer me a job? I think you were kind of offering me a job.
I was.
That's when I really knew I had to leave.
Yeah,
Okay.
You'd scrape the bottom of the barrel. But I think there are two myths about the way we've been talking about these aircraft. One, focusing on the fact urban air mobility exclusively an urban mission. It is not really an urban mission alone, and it really isn't just an unmanned mission alone. It's a very highly automated aircraft. So the integration strategy that we have is starting with the smalls and moving on up through larger and larger aircraft and more complex missions, starting to put in place the regulatory pieces on the operations and certification side, and then also putting in the airspace management pieces. And I would encourage everyone to go comment on our latest piece of regulation and airspace management. It's really a hybrid called remote identification. It's currently in the Federal Register, and we're looking for public comments, and that's all I'm going to say about remote identification today. So if you ask me a lot of questions, I will just refer you back to the docket. But this is really our FAA mission, and when I started working in this area, we were really at the bottom, lower left-hand side of this. And we were just doing Section 333 operations. We had just approved Part 107. We really didn't have our low altitude authorization and notification capability. But in approximately 2.5 years, we have gone 3/4 of the way up this. And we are really facing a time when the last challenge for our small UASs is going to be economically viable, manufacturing ready, and scalable beyond visual line of sight. And we think we're very close to that. Now, why is this important for urban air mobility? Because like I said, we're not viewing this purely as the size of the aircraft. We're looking at these technologies, and what we see is the work that we're doing now on the regulation and the operation side is really preparing the path for the larger aircraft. Apparently, I made some news a couple of weeks ago. I was unaware people were tracking my comments so quickly, but mentioning that we have 6 projects in type certification at the moment for UAM. And we have recently gone up from 12 to 41 type certification projects in the small UASs. So we're really prepared. We think we know our regulatory framework. We don't need a lot of changes to the rules. We do think that we can evolve the regulatory framework. Our airspace management side is coming along. And that leaves the last two pillars of NASA's 5 pillars. They talk about the aircraft, the airmen, the airspace. They also talk about the need for infrastructure and community engagement. And one of our early learnings right now is we in the FAA, and largely what we're telling you on this slide, we know how to do the aircraft, we know how to certify the airmen, and we know how to get them into the airspace. But the real key to unlocking this mid-range capability of urban air mobility is the infrastructure it will use, not only in our cities, but in our rural areas, and gaining the community acceptance. So we're now starting to pivot our activities and start looking to identify more and more partners that we can work with in terms of cities or other locations that want to build infrastructure, that want to bring these operations to their communities, so we can start finding places where we can bring this whole ecosystem together. So with that, I think I've taken most, if not all, of my time, but the message that I have in summary is it is an ecosystem of those 5 pillars. We're well prepared on the FAA side for the main 3, and we're starting to pivot and reach out on the infrastructure and community. Thanks, Jim.
All right, great. Over to Nikhil.
Well, thank you for that, Jay. Really great introduction. I think my slides are pulling up, but perfect. Would love to back up a little bit and talk about why we're all here, which is ultimately cities and making cities smarter, better, more efficient places to live. Half of the world's population today lives in cities. And the UN projects that by 2045, that number will reach over 6 billion people. That's 2/3 of the Earth's population moving into urban cores. And while cities are getting larger, transportation continues to get worse. Transportation continues to get more congested, slower, less reliable, and more expensive. Uber really focuses on reversing that trend and radically improving urban mobility, transportation that can be faster, more reliable, cheaper, and cleanly move people and things from A to B. And so a few years ago, we started thinking about this a little bit differently. Just like skyscrapers were able to reduce residential and commercial congestion on the ground and take to the air, we said, could we do the same with transportation? And this was really the original vision. San Francisco to San Jose, where most of Uber is headquartered. This is a trip that tens of thousands of people take every single day in the Bay Area. It takes almost 2 hours by car, 2.5 by train. The question we asked ourselves was, could we do this with an Uber Air product in about 15 minutes end to end? And we wrote this up in our Uber Elevate white paper. So myself, Jeff Holden, our former CPO, Mark Moore, who's sitting here in the front row from NASA, and Mark really invented distributed electric propulsion across his over 3 decades at NASA. DEP, of course, and I think most of the panelists up here, as well as folks in the audience, are familiar at this point, is really the secret sauce behind this aircraft, an eVTOL, an all-electric vertical takeoff and landing air taxi. And what we did was we sat down and said, what are the specifications based on all of the data Uber has around how people move in and around cities across basic dimensions? Speed, so about 150 to 200 miles an hour. Payload, a pilot plus 4 passengers, so that we can use our Uber Pool technology to batch multiple people into the same aircraft in order to get to an economic price point that's viable. Range, so about 60 miles, which covers over 90% of the trips that people take across all of our cities around the world, in addition to 100% all electric from day one. A noise level that's about 100 times quieter than a helicopter. And of course, safety is our top priority, not just for the aircraft, but for the operations holistically. And you fast forward to today, we've got over 10 partners who are working on Uber Elevate aircraft with us. 8 of them are public. The top row that you see here are companies that I think everyone is familiar with, large manufacturers both in the aircraft and automobile space. In the bottom row, it would be a stretch to call them startups because they've got hundreds of millions of dollars of funding, but are new entrants into the space that are saying, listen, eVTOL is the future, urban air mobility is the future, and we're going to go build an aircraft per the Uber Elevate requirements to go play in the space. We recently announced earlier this year, just a few weeks ago at CES, Hyundai Motor Group as one of those partners. So Hyundai hired Dr. Jaewon Shin from NASA. Dr. Shin led a lot of the UAM work at NASA and was one of the original pioneers for the space. Hyundai announced not only hiring Dr. Shin, but they announced a $1.5 billion investment in the space to fund specifically UAM. And this aircraft that you see here is the SA-1. This was actually co-designed with Uber. So Uber took a page out of NASA's playbook, and we released several ECRMs, effectively these eVTOL common reference models that fit our requirements, and Hyundai took a lot of inspiration from that to design this, and we unveiled it at CES. They built a 1-to-1 scale mock-up at CES. Our CEO, Dara, came to meet their EVC, Dr. Chung, and we announced this partnership to the world. The second partnership we announced very recently was Joby Aviation. For those of you who know Joby was founded by JoBen Bivert. JoBen has been working on Joby Aviation just as long as Uber's been working on Uber. They were founded the same month in 2009, and just recently, Toyota announced a $500 million investment in Joby, leading their Series C. And so both of these companies represent not only a massive amount of capital going to build, test, and certify aircraft, but also two automotive giants who have decided to say, hey, we're going to go build an eVTOL for Uber Elevate. And not only that, but bring our world-class automotive manufacturing capabilities to the eVTOL space, which is super important because we expect in the numbers that these will be deployed across cities for the aircraft to be manufactured less like aircraft, but more like cars. And of course, Jay was at the TRB just a couple of weeks ago, making 3 key points, right? And we think of this as super important, Jay, in terms of what you said around, one, there is no regulatory change required, which is super important to the way that we think about Elevate and getting into cities quickly and safely. 2 is that there are 6 aircraft programs that are actively in certification process. And then 3, you pointed to some of the work that ride-sharing companies are doing to envelop the air portion in order to create a fully end-to-end multimodal trip. And so that was important, and that sort of vote of confidence from the FAA was important, not for Uber, but really the entire industry. And so the way that we're thinking about this is multimodal. As Jay mentioned in his comments and the way that we think about Uber Air holistically, these aren't going to take off and land in your backyard, but rather involve a ground portion from your home or your office to the nearest skyport. You'll fly to your destination skyport, and when you get there, your car or your bike or your scooter or your self-driving automobile will be there waiting for you to take you to your final destination. And so the way that we think about placing those vertiports is really looking at the demand of trips that we have to and from A to B all across our cities around the world, and thinking about how do we use existing infrastructure. This was really the first visualization that we put forth of a skyport. It's simple, but really what's great is the idea of taking existing infrastructure that today is worth very little, whether it's the top of a parking garage, the top of a building, and turning it into an Uber Elevate skyport that we can go place in the most frequented parts of the city. And ultimately, over time, we expect that there will be larger pieces of infrastructure at the most common nodes. You can imagine near a stadium or connecting into an existing mobility hub that serves public transit or road traffic today, really ultimately serving up to thousands of aircraft per hour from a single location. And so, look, our approach holistically here is not to do everything ourselves at Uber, but to really stand on the shoulders of giants and work with companies in this room and out of this room who are already experts. So I mentioned all of the partners we're working with to build electric aircraft for our system. We are working equally as close with financiers and real estate developers who are building skyports in Uber cities. In-house at Uber, we're working on the network technologies, what we call the Elevate Cloud Services, everything from digital air traffic management to the aerial ride-sharing technology to string together trips end-to-end. as well as the operations on the ground that we're already beginning to test in New York City through our operations today. And ultimately, our goal is to make this more affordable than owning and operating your own car. And the breakdown of it's pretty simple. Helicopters today are about $10 a passenger mile. Instantly from day one, we expect about a third of that to be chopped off simply due to the higher efficiency of eVTOL aircraft that are quieter, all electric, and fast. And over time, within a couple of years, our calculations tell us that we'll get to the price of about an UberX by the mile. And that's important because it's a great trade-off between time, cost, and privacy of either taking your own car via UberX today or flying from A to B. And we get there through high utilization and high load factor of the aircraft. And over time, through scaled manufacturing and full autonomy of the aircraft, we'll get to the bogey of about 50 cents per passenger mile. And so we are really focused on making sure this is not just for the few rich and wealthy across the city, but really accessible to anyone who wants to travel from A to B. And so I'll show you a quick video. We are planning to launch across Los Angeles, Melbourne, and Dallas in 2023, and inspired by a lot of the partners, Bell of which is one, and inspired by working really closely with the FAA to launch quickly and also safely. Good. Love to hand it over to you, Travis.
Oh, perfect. Good afternoon. I'm representing Airbus today, which, as many of you know, has been designing, certifying, and manufacturing aircraft for decades. So I want to just say thank you to my colleagues. And if you haven't had a chance to visit the booth downstairs, please do so. There are many folks from Airbus Helicopters that are happy to answer your questions about what we're doing today and obviously what we plan to do tomorrow. I'll speak really briefly about what's driving our approach and then talk a little bit about some of the technologies that we are exploring at Airbus. I've been reading a little biography on Igor Sikorsky lately about one of the fathers of our industry. And there's a quote that he said about the early days of aviation that I think are relevant for our discussion today. He says, "We were ignorant, and we were ignorant at the fact that we were ignorant. That's ignorance squared, and it often led to disaster." I think when we as technologists and innovators start to explore new things, it's really easy, as research says, for us to get overconfident, and that overconfidence isn't all bad. There are some advantages to overconfidence because we can really, when we're being overconfident, imagine the future and imagine what that future could look like. And I think we would all agree that there's no short of imagination when we talk about urban air mobility. There's no shortage of kind of designs about what this future and what this market could look like. But the downsides of overconfidence is that we don't often see our blind sides as innovators and entrepreneurs. And I think a data point for us we can find right in our space of transportation. We can look at interesting things like scooters that are being introduced to our society. The technology is done. I think, it's in some respects baked, but as Jay was talking about community impact, there are other questions that end up becoming very important for market entry, and for market sustainability. And when those things aren't addressed, the scooters disappear. And I think the lesson for us in the urban air mobility space is for us to get the pace right, and for us to think about what blind spots are we not considering to ensure this market not only launches, but has sustainability. So really at Airbus, I can say that we're not in a rush. We want to make sure that whatever efforts we pursue in this area are safe, that they're reliable, that we address the right sorts of community questions around this sort of technology, because we want to make sure our ignorance in some respects is low and that we can really square this market and avoid any sort of issues and failures that may occur. And some of that is expected. But I think when you can look at what other like transportation efforts, even in our space and much broader than that, when you think about emerging technologies and emerging markets are going through, because this is a market entry problem, it's a market development problem, it also is a technology problem, but I suspect based on what we see going on in our market already, we will be slowed or delayed significantly by the other aspects, infrastructure and community impact that Jay mentioned, that will really scale this sort of technology. So our driver for this is we're in no rush, and you will see us kind of take that approach at Airbus of really being very thoughtful about some of the underlying technologies and the issues surrounding them that will ensure long-term sustainability and viability for the market. I also address a couple of things that we're exploring. As many of you have probably seen, we take a technology demonstrator approach to this. We want to demonstrate that this can work by actually building things and testing it, flying it. Some of you may have saw the news that we have closed our Vahana project, and I know there's a question about what that actually means. It was always intended to be closed because it was a technology demonstrator, and that's our one-passenger electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicle that you can see downstairs at the hall. And we were exploring sense and avoid capabilities with that project, as well as looking at propulsion, the propulsion topics related to that vehicle. And there's some learnings from that project that is actually transformed, and I can talk about that a little later, or translated into the larger company. We also have City Airbus that is still operational in Europe, and we're working through kind of the performance requirements of that vehicle and some of the testing associated with that vehicle. And that project will close once we get through those lists of things to do. And we will start exploring what a new vehicle configuration could look like based on those learnings and others that we know just from a history of designing and manufacturing aircraft. We also believe, as I alluded to before, that this problem is much bigger than the vehicle. So we are leaning into the airspace operations and airspace technology efforts. Our unmanned traffic management team is involved in many efforts in Europe with Cesar and EASA, as well as here in the US with FAA, the LANCE program, as well as the newly announced remote ID pilot efforts. And that team is always super busy working on what are the questions surrounding how we can integrate more automatic and autonomous operations into our airspace and reimagine what the next generation of air traffic management could look like. And if you haven't, please read that team's blueprint, utmblueprint.com. I think if you go there, it'll redirect you to the corporate website. But that is another effort. We think that you can have a vehicle done, but there are all sorts of airspace operations, technology that needs to be developed, procedures that need to be refined in order to have the scales that we all imagine and that we all see imagined in some of our visions. The other effort that we're really trying to figure out is what is it going to be like to be in the business of actually operating a UAM operation. So VOOM is our effort to build an online helicopter booking platform, and the CEO Clement is actually sitting here in the room, and his team is busy every day in Sao Paulo and San Francisco and potentially some other areas in the world, having people book a helicopter or rotorcraft, certified rotorcraft, to go from point A to point B in those cities. And we're learning a lot about the friction of that operation, Because it's not just about the vehicle, it's not just about the airspace operations, it's about what it's like when a person arrives to that location and needs to go from point A to point B, needs to get in the aircraft, needs to get off the aircraft and obviously get to their destination. There's a lot that goes into that, and there's a lot of learnings that we've learned from that. And going back to what Jay mentioned, and I'm sure others will talk about, there's the infrastructure question. Where are these vehicles going to land? If we use existing helipads and existing infrastructure, how can we reimagine those assets to ensure that these vehicles can actually land, that they can actually charge, that the grid and that all the resources of that city are positioned to handle the load that's coming? And we already, again, we know this is an issue because it's already an issue for electric vehicles in many places around the world. So going back to what I said before, and I'm happy to answer more specific questions, this is much bigger than a vehicle, and for us, we want to make sure that we get the speed of this right. Because at the end of the day, whether we're carrying things or people, these are sensitive assets. And I think the brilliance and the beauty of what's been built right now in commercial aviation is we don't really bat an eye when we get on an airplane. We believe we're going to get from point A to point B successfully. And I think we should create the same sort of certainty in our space over time, near and long term. So thank you to Jim and Chris and the team for inviting us, and we look forward to answering your questions.
All right, great.
Hi, so do we have a video? All right, so that's just a glimpse of the aircraft that we unveiled a few weeks ago. Along with that unveiling, we also unveiled our version of the smart city and the digital infrastructure that's required. It's really interesting being up here, and it looks like we all reading from the same notes. Because, and that's a good thing, because the message, you know, we all understand that it's more than a vehicle, it's more than the technology. The Nexus 4EX that we unveiled, has our, our four-duct ducted rotor, tilting, powered lift. That configuration, which is different than what we had last year, is actually unlocked the all-electric vehicle for Bell. Our vehicle last year was hybrid electric, and some of the testing that we had done on ducts and some of the improvements in batteries has actually unlocked the 4EX. And that's where we're headed. It doesn't dictate that it's an all-electric vehicle. It can be agnostic to the propulsion system. But I think, that's what there's a better business case around an all-electric. I think everyone would agree for this urban air mobility. To get the noise down, to have the safety, that's where we all need to head, and that's where we need to be. Along with that, it's already been mentioned 3 times about the ecosystem, and it's more than the technology. Our focus at Bell has been on the technology. We know how to build an airframe and structure, but as we move towards electric distribution, as back into ducts, we haven't had ducts since the 60s in the X-22, and it was completely different, a different configuration. I think it was 5,000 horsepower, pushing 4 ducts, none of which is going to work in an all-electric vehicle. But it is a technology that we believe in, and a technology that we believe the public, it's approachable, it's going to provide the safety that we need, and that's our goal. We have to have a safe vehicle. People have to be comfortable getting on and off of it. It's a different audience than we have today in a lot of our helicopter operations. And it requires something more than the vehicle. It requires all the things that have already been discussed, the regulatory piece, the infrastructure piece, and And our vision is to, put services and experiences together, to earn trust, to make everybody believe it's safe. And in order to do that, all of the pieces that have already been discussed today, with infrastructure, with certification, with, I guess we haven't talked a lot about manufacturing, but that's a big piece of this, because this is on a different scale than at least the helicopter industry has been before. It's not building, 1 or 200 of a given model in a given year. For the business case to work, it's got to be at a larger scale. If it's going to be on a larger scale, we're going to have to build them differently. And that's a big piece of what we're doing at Bell, is to understand how are we going to manufacture these aircraft. Because you don't get the option of certifying a vehicle and then deciding how to manufacture it in a different way, because now you're starting over. And I think it's easy to forget that, because we're all engineers. We can get real quick and come up with a design, but it may not be the design that we can make 2,000 of a year at the price point that it needs to be, because operating cost and the price point are going to be very important to this. So that's our vision, that's our goal. I hope it's everyone in this room's. It is going to take all of the pieces, and we're looking forward to the future.
All right, Jerry, thanks. What am I?
Thank you, Jim. I have to stand up to see the screen here, so if that's all right. So my name is Mike Diamond. I'm with NEXA. And my talk today is really directed to HAI members, to helicopter operators, those operating under Part 135 or Part 91, who stand to be the kingmakers in this industry. And I think we all know why, and that is that this is an industry that prides its operations on safety. And this is the type of operator that needs to launch this industry. When you have a flight operation that already has embedded in it safety systems, quality programs, pilot training, all that sort of stuff, you are the right kind of leader to help this industry get going. So I want to talk a little bit about what's driving urban air mobility. It's already been mentioned a couple of times. So perhaps I'll just stress a couple of points here. One is that populations are shifting. They're both growing and shifting to urban areas. By about 2050, there will be more than 2 billion additional residents of urban areas around the world. Now that concentration of population is going to vary by continent and by country, et cetera. But still, that's a very significant amount, because highways won't keep up with that type of growth in concentration of populations. And what happens under those circumstances is that congestion creates several impacts. One is that mobility suffers. When mobility suffers, things slow down. If you think about a medevac or an ambulance just trying to get from point A to point B in a densely congested city, that ambulance 10 or 20 years from now might take an extra hour to make the trip to a hospital for an emergency or casualty. So congestion really does impact quality of life. The other issue is that, and New York City's actually been talking this up for quite some time, congestion creates a negative economic impact. New York itself, the general New York area, is, in their view, the view of the city and planners, costing the economy. It's a $1.5 trillion economy in New York. And there's about 100 billion of that, the economy is degraded today by congestion-related problems. So that's a very significant, that's about 6%. And when you think about it, all cities are paying the price of congestion. It's not just quality of life issues. It's also that the economy cannot perform without efficient mobility. So these graphs point to that. I think this material is going to be available. I should also mention that we've released a white paper today on this topic, there are copies up front. You can get those afterwards. But I point to 10 reasons why, in particular, the helicopter industry needs to think about electrification of its business. The first of those is that it's really an easy transition to go from where you are today as a helicopter operator to operating electric vehicles. So the impediments are very low. Secondly, I talked about societal benefits that the helicopter industry can actually get in front of. When you think of all the critiquing and negative comments or sensibilities about the helicopter industry, this industry has the opportunity to really step out and begin to contribute to and to try to solve problems that are facing society today. There are also dramatic new revenues for operators. I'm going to throw some figures out in a couple of minutes, but this is a multi-billion dollar opportunity for this industry to find new sources of revenue and to be able to become more profitable, more viable, and a more vibrant contributor to the economy. Material operating cost reductions are there. We've already heard a couple of speakers talk about this. It's expected that operating an electric VTOL might reduce hourly or passenger costs, if you like, by 30, 40, 50% under some circumstances. So this means that margins are going to improve for operators. Number 6 is that there are a lot of external investments driving costs ever lower. We talk about the automotive sector being able to invest heavily in batteries. We're going to see big investments in hydrogen over time. And this industry has the ability to take advantage of those investments without necessarily having to eat the costs of those investments. Reduced noise. We've seen some data come out recently, just the last couple of months, showing these vehicles may produce a noise signature that is perhaps between 60 and 65 decibels. And that's incredible when you consider where current turbine-powered helicopters are today. So that's a very, very significant reason why cities might welcome these vehicles back. If they're solving social problems and you can't hear them, or you only hear a little bit, that's very, very powerful. Number 8 is something that we all have to work on, in this industry in particular, but it's that there should be safety benefits. Multiple rotors, batteries, less things to break, reduced parts count, more stable flight envelope for these vehicles. There are all kinds of good reasons to expect that safety flight is going to be improved. Number 9 is lower acquisition costs for these vehicles. A gas turbine helicopter in the price range that we know today can be reduced with vehicles that should have similar endurance for short flights, et cetera. And then lastly, there are brand new markets that the helicopter industry does not serve today. And by adopting electric vehicles, being able to go into significant volume flights for, let's say, the airport shuttles, and being able to design corridors to fly through city areas or suburbs where you're not flying over top of people. All of this, the technology that's coming around, including UATM, et cetera, it's very exciting. I said we'd mention something about prices, so market opportunity. So I think many of you know that NEXA finished a market study last year. We just released a third version of it, updated it. But for 75 cities around the world, our estimate of UAM vehicle operator revenue potential over 20 years is in the range of $200 billion. Now that's over 20 years, and a lot of that is backloaded. But that is in very sharp contrast to where this industry is today. So I don't want to use the word windfall at all, but I'm saying that by paying attention, the next 5 years, the helicopter industry can be taking its methodical approach to this over the next few years, so you're positioned to be able to take advantage of these new vehicles and begin to operate them in services that are heretofore not permissible. There are other costs that we estimated, like infrastructure. So, we represent infrastructure investment in the range of billions of dollars. The cost, we think, to implement traffic management systems and the ground infrastructure is on this chart. I think it's about 13 billion and 19 billion. So that's for 75 cities. My point on that is that anybody know what the big dig cost to put the freeways under the city of Boston? It was like $55 billion. That's one city, one class of infrastructure. So that you have to put into context the fact that for urban air mobility to thrive, it's not really that expensive. I mean, we're throwing around billions of dollars, but it's not that, in relevant terms, expensive that, in fact, it's attractive enough so that the private sector has both the willingness and the ability to put up that money when business cases come forward. And that's one of the things that we're working toward is hearing from consortia what the business case is. So my last chart is just to give you a little bit of data on Greater New York, because New York is legendary for its irritability when it comes to conventional helicopter operations and the like. But New York it's the largest economy that we have in the United States, $1.4 trillion in GDP annually. They rank 4th worst in the United States for congestion. And the congestion cost estimated by the city and planners is about $100 billion a year. So that's 6% degradation in economic output. That's a very significant amount. And that can only go up unless new modes of transportation can come into play in this area. So some of the data regarding what it would take for New York. New York already has 167 heliports in the region that this map is showing you. That sounds pretty good. Frankly, most of these heliports will not be useful when it comes to designing optimal networks. So there's more investment needed to retrofit the heliports that can work and support profitable networks, and then additional capital needed to go and build things like megaports, the Uber concept, and so forth. So market demand is good. I love to talk about the concept of price elasticity and price inelastic markets. So there's demand for electric VTOL today from the business aviation community. There's demand, but there's no supply yet. Price is not the key driver. You don't buy a business jet to save money on travel, do you? So that's when I make the point about price elastic and price inelastic markets. It's important to understand that the inelastic markets can be served very quickly and right away. So I'll conclude just by showing that there's a range of infrastructure, obviously, that is going to be needed to be designed optimally to begin to serve urban areas. Shown here are some samples. There's some good work on this chart from many different sources. And when we talk about these concepts, I urge HAI members, operators, to please get up the learning curve. This is your opportunity. Thank you.
All right, well, great. I think that's been a great presentation as we covered multiple aspects of what everybody's bringing to the future. And Mike, when you were using words like, can survive, I think I'll probably be putting words in your mouth now, but you're talking about, this is the future. There's not an option out there. There's variations to it, but not necessarily an option to go in a different direction. So I applaud everybody for bringing the information in, and I want to let you know that, from HAI's perspective, we agree that fits into our association, and we want to be on board as we try to help get through, the noise issues. We talked about being as safe as possible, and then of course the infrastructure. And none of that is new to the helicopter community. So we see working hand in hand with these new vehicles because they provide that vertical lift that society needs to accomplish, that part of the segment. And that's not the business jet, but it's that last, 35 miles or 60 miles. So you can move the big distances by a jet, by a big fast mover, but you need that vertical lift vehicle to get that last little portion in there. And so we are on board with you as we move forward in this. I saw the Los Angeles 2023. I mean, that's pretty much right around the corner when you talk about certification and work with the federal agencies. And so, again, hopefully, the detailed plan of how government's working with industry of metrics and tables so we know when you're staying on track and what are the hurdles that are out there that you both agree on so that we can make sure that we address them. And when one changes, you know, we can try to figure out, do we have to adjust the whole plan, or how do we keep on track? Because 2023, 3 years is just around the corner. So I like that out there. A stretch goal, I guess, hopefully, or is that a solid goal? How would you call it?
Yeah, look, all indications, at least from our end, are that we're on track for it, right? And the way that we think about it is, you know, we're going to fly when we're safe, and we're going to work really closely with our manufacturers such that we can continue to work not only with our OEMs, but also with the FAA to keep close tabs on that timeline. And so we started Elevate about 3.5 years ago. And at that time, we took a look at the manufacturing landscape and said, listen, who out there is working with us to build aircraft? Bell was one of the first that we announced in our first group. And we said, listen, it's going to take about 3 years to design and iterate on the aircraft itself, and then another 3 or so years to get the type certification and production certification for the aircraft. And so that's why, Jay, I mentioned, you know, your comments were so important, that there are already a number of eVTOL programs that are actively under certification, and once they are certified, that's when we'll fly.
So talked about certification, and I know from my background on the standard side of trying to figure out, you know, how you know, who's going to identify what the pilot qualifications are to operate these vehicles?
That's a really good question, and that's why we want to get started with the manufacturers of the aircraft and understanding their design, because the big shift that we're seeing is in traditional rotorcraft or traditional manned aviation, the interface between the pilot and the aircraft has been pretty standard for about the last 50 years. The same is true, the interface between that aircraft and the air traffic control system. Pretty standard. Those interfaces, those roles and responsibilities haven't shifted. We saw it first in the small community, but now we're seeing it over and over again in vertical and in the fixed wing community. Those boundaries are all moving. As aircraft become more autonomous, on the very small end, things that were done by pilots are now done by the aircraft. We're seeing that same trend start to move forward. Mentioned several times here, UTM, the UAS traffic management system, which is really going to be a part of a larger ecosystem that includes flight rules and manufacturing and type certification and all of that. But that's all going to have to come together. But what's driving it is, what are the design decisions we're making in that aircraft? Because then that's going to tell us what that pilot needs to do, what the qualifications are, what the training is, how that pilot will interact with the airspace. And from what I've seen, the various concepts coming in, they range everywhere from a standard pilot with the standard interfaces we know today, to the remotely piloted vehicle where there is a pilot, it's just not sitting in the aircraft. In the middle there's a safety pilot concept, and there are some who are proposing true autonomous. I think those are a little further out. We see that collection of the three standard pilot today, safety pilot and remote pilot, all coming at about the same time. So a very long way to build out that ecosystem for you. But the answer to your question is, it's driven by the design of the aircraft, because that will determine the shift in these interfaces and roles and responsibilities.
Okay. So I have some questions here, but I think I'd like to first open it up to the floor. If there's some questions out there, I mean, you saw the experts we have here and the different types of opportunities out there. Do we have any questions from the floor? Okay, in the back. Yep, please come up to the microphone.
Thanks for this great panel. First, let's talk about remote ID. Kidding. I'll let you know. I'm not going to do that.
I sit on enough of these panels. The first question always goes to the regulator.
Exactly.
Well, this is actually probably going to be more aimed at the representative from Bell. Looking back at the history of civil tilt rotor, where there was an awful lot of conversation that sounds an awful lot like what we were talking about right now for urban air mobility, the XV-15 derivative aircraft, if you will. Infrastructure, vertiports, urban areas, taking people away from the long runways, a lot of common themes. By the way, I'm Craig Schmidtman with aerospacenews.com. How are we going to overcome the NIMBYism? We talked about Los Angeles. I grew up there. 2023 sounds pretty aggressive. I've been involved with 2 airport associations dealing with trying to keep regular airports alive. And I'm optimistic that you're going to succeed, but I'm really concerned that this sounds an awful lot like essentially the derivative of XV-15 that didn't show up as we expected, to take people away from those painful segments for regional flying, get away from those long runways. Thanks very much.
Right. So I'll attempt to answer your question. One is we have to learn from that. We have to learn from the XV-15 to the 609 and where that is today. And it's a complicated equation. The difference here, I think, is there's a bigger audience, there's a bigger understanding of everything that it takes. We take the XV-15 and we say, we have this great tilt rotor, it has these capabilities. Obviously, we entered into the regulatory piece as being the first. That's going to happen in this. We all have to learn from, the powered lift. I would still call it powered lift with these, the VTOL takeoff and getting on wing, because most of these vehicles are going to need to do that. In order to make use of the all-electric, you're going to have to get the power down. To get the power down, I think most people will choose a format that they can get on a wing, because that helps you by 40, 50% in a lot of cases. So I think the answer to the question is we have to learn from that. We have to be a little more forward-thinking in everything that needs to come together so that we don't have a vehicle, but we don't have the infrastructure. Or we have the infrastructure, we don't have the regulations or the airspace management or the pilot training. Because kind of following up on some of that discussion about pilots, we have a project going on right now that it's called Future Flight Controls. And we've made some simulators, and part of that is to start looking at, hey, is there some intuitive things that we as OEMs haven't thought about, haven't looked at? Maybe it's a game controller. It's not the conventional controls. Those are all the things that are going to have to come together because we're not going to be able to find enough commercial pilots for this to actually grow into what it needs. There is going to have to be automation. Our Bell's process here is going to be, yes, it's a 4+1 aircraft. It starts with a pilot. Obviously, the goal is to ultimately get the pilot out of there, but it's going to be different than it is today in a conventional helicopter.
If I may add to that, the other community that needs to learn is the regulator community, and working with local partners. Well, we see the very beginnings of that in our integration pilot program, where the White House asked us to establish some relationships with state, local, tribal authorities across the U.S. The biggest learning out of this program is not technology. It is the fact that a community engagement is so important. And it's important that everyone do it together. It can't just be the operator out there or the manufacturer or the regulator. It's got to be that community coming together, and that community has to see it's safe, it's secure, and it meets needs of the community. And all three of those pieces, when they come together magically, I shouldn't use the word magic, because it's not magic. It is well designed when it comes together, right? That's where we're seeing these very innovative operations take hold, and we're seeing the communities push them forward. Two examples, while commercial package delivery might not be saving lives in Christiansburg, Virginia, it's highly accepted there, right? Chula Vista, California, just down the road outside of San Diego. Drone is the first responder. That community is asking the police department to fly more and more because they see the direct benefit that those aircraft are providing to them. So these are the two examples where we saw those components come together and drive the operation forward.
I think that's absolutely right, Jay. And if I can point out one thing, which is for us, at least in my opinion, one of the key enablers for this is we now have feasible all-electric propulsion, right? And that enables so many of these factors that are important to our communities. Noise, right? These are 100 times quieter than helicopters and effectively inaudible, when they're flying over cities.
I will remind you from my airport colleagues' experience, people see noise.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Certainly. And so, look, it's a piece that we're going to have to continue preaching and continue working closely with the members of our community. Megan Pritchard there in the third row, she runs our LA business and has started already working closely with every stakeholder group across the community, and that's really important to us. Not just talking about noise, right, but talking about safety, talking about how infrastructure no longer requires fuel, privacy, and all of the factors that are important to not just our riders, but all of the folks who are going to be members of our community. And so, couldn't agree more with you.
All right. Great discussion. Yes.
Yes, sir. Brendan O'Reilly. Thank you to the panel. I'm the airport manager of Fullerton, just 7 miles away, which I know.
Thank you for the pre-staging of all the helicopters.
We're glad to have you. I just want to put the message out. We're very excited about UAM. In fact, my city manager is here with us today. The city's excited about what's coming. What can we do to better position small airports to accept this service? I personally see this as a game changer for small airports. I think it's logical that an Uber Air is going to start out at a small airport, not a congested airport. We have the capacity. We're even in design for a new administration building that could serve as a terminal for this. I know that we've heard from the manufacturers that bringing in electric service for the charging infrastructure is important. Is there any other tips you can give to small airport operators so we can be ready for this? And is there any association or how do we get the word out to other airport operators of what to expect and how to position ourselves well for this coming?
So I'll take a first cut at that. In our market studies and research, we've come to a fairly focused conclusion that cities need to be part of wider consortia of stakeholders in order to get urban air mobility, off the ground, if I can use that metaphor. So that involves airports. It involves the city council, likely the transportation authorities, whether it's state or local or provincial. And it also involves operators who have to bring not just their expertise, but their willingness to begin flying when the circumstances are suitable. The cost of putting infrastructure into airports doesn't have to be prohibitive. You're already certified as an airport to be able to take helicopters, and so that part of it is not a difficult thing. But with higher volumes of transit and more vehicles, safety becomes an issue, passenger egress, things that are going to be design and safety challenges. So I would, for one, encourage the airport, since you're already up the learning curve, to begin looking around for others who can join you to establish a broad coalition a broad coalition willing to begin the duties and processes of designing airspace. Airspace needs to be designed. Air corridors have to be designed and noise signatures across neighborhoods demonstrated to be acceptable, that sort of thing. So there's an analytical phase to moving from where we are today, concept, to actual operations. And if you're the centroid of this for this area of Southern California, that's great. invite others to join you. I think before you know it, you'll have a leadership position in the LA Basin.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would also say, you know, a lot of what's developing here is technology, but there's also, prior to us seeing the scale that we expect, there's also people thinking about what is a business model and an approach to a business look like. And so right now, there are all sorts of people exploring business models in the urban air mobility space using existing assets, whether that be aircraft themselves or rotorcraft, fixed wing or rotorcraft. And so one of the things that we're taking advantage of with Voom, as I mentioned earlier, our on-demand booking platform for existing certified rotorcraft, is we're taking advantage of some of the airport assets that are in the Northern California region as well as São Paulo, Brazil. And I think it's a useful asset for us as we really explore what the emerging technology could be like once it arrives, but in the near term, what the business model itself can look like as it's here with existing assets. So I would really encourage airports to lean into all the excitement that will happen that we're already seeing with new companies popping up, potentially maybe our own, exploring what this market could look like just from a market development perspective and a new business model perspective. I think that's something that can be done right now. And I also agree with this notion that airports and cities are part of the stakeholder list. One of the things that we looked at is we did a pretty detailed analysis of all the things that have been written about urban air mobility over the last 5 years, and we found a huge gap. One of those gaps is what can we do near term in the next 5 years to really address and position some of the existing assets, thinking, and stakeholders that we have to fully adopt and accept urban air mobility once it's here, broadly defined. As you know, some people are looking at manned platforms, some people are looking at self-piloted platforms. So saying UAM is a bit of a mouthful because it can mean a lot of things. But what can be done right now? And I think you will hear us talk more about that over the next couple months, because we think that there's a laundry list of things from an infrastructure perspective, security, from a vehicle perspective, from a community engagement perspective, and from an airspace perspective, things that can be done right now, at least over the next 5 years, to really position us well for the next 10, for the next 20, and for the next 30. So really appreciate and welcome the question. And I think, as I said, I think we should lean into the exploration of these new business models as well as position ourselves now for what's coming.
Okay, so as you can tell, lots of knowledge up here in the panel. So do we have any other questions? Great.
Yes, I'm Dan Ryan with Kierfot Corporation. This question is for Uber. You showed a lot of industry partners and a lot of investment. Are they heading toward one common vehicle? Are they trying to compete to make that vehicle? Or do you see multiple types and platforms for different markets?
No, it's a great question. The question was, you know, are these aircraft manufacturers competing? Are they making the same aircraft? What we've seen is actually really interesting. Over the last 3 years, there's over 100 companies that are building eVTOLs of all sorts of configurations. And the partners that I showed earlier, we've got 10, 8 of which are public, are all taking really novel, different approaches. And that's really exciting for us because our requirements leave a ton of room for implementation. You know, we think about the most important high order bits: range, speed, payload, all electric, quiet, and safe. But we've seen a number of companies take really different approaches, right? Joby, which released kind of a photo of their aircraft, is of course taking a tilt rotor approach. There are companies that are doing vectored thrust versus lift plus cruise. And so we see a number of companies taking different approaches, and I'm sure you have seen a myriad of approaches kind of go across the certification table as well.
Absolutely. Everything you said, and what is a startup today, as it becomes successful, is likely to become a part of a larger product line. We've seen a lot of that. We've also seen that most of the trends are moving towards interoperability. So we see a number of companies that are looking to fill in their aviation supply chain, everything from long haul, medium haul, 300 miles. But they're also learning from their last mile aircraft, and they're all kind of meeting in this middle and merging their technologies, looking at a lot of reuse of components, ideas, that sort of thing. So it's a very exciting time. I would also add that we see more of a bifurcation around the human transport versus pure cargo. And I would invite our manufacturers to talk about that. But to me, that's the bigger distinction we're seeing.
Yep. No, I think that's right. And I think, look, we have taken a couple of fairly hard stances, right? We are committed to being all electric from day one. We are committed to having these aircraft flown by human pilots from day one. But we are really excited to see the different approaches manufacturers are taking.
Yeah, I mean, I think the place to look is really the small UAS space with some of this, and you're seeing everything from some of the heavier lift vehicles that are capable to lift really, really heavy things, to everyone from Wing and some of the other manufacturers around the world and operators around the world that are delivering blood in other areas of the world and other critical things. So I think it'd be really interesting to see what happens on the small side and what the requirements around that will be on the small side. I think from a UAM perspective, it's our approach that we know that probably one passenger type of vehicles are probably most profitable. We also know that as you operate a business where you have a pilot in the mix, that there are costs associated with that, but also certainty that comes along with that in the near term from a passenger perspective. So we do know that there are variables that when you start to consider them, increase or decrease the costs associated with vehicle development and operations related to that vehicle. So I think you'll see a lot of people trying a lot of things, quote, in real time. I think you'll see a few people testing certain business models and whether or not they're carrying things or carrying people. I think it'll be a bit of a race because there are a lot of questions. Where are you operating? What's the throughput of that operation? I think one of the limitations that you may see in some places of the world are hours of operation limitations, given maybe community pushback on noise or even visual pollution, which is a type of pollution that we already know the agency is dealing with in other areas of aviation. So I think all this really matters, and the beauty of it is you have companies from Uber to Google to others, and even some of the ones that you expect looking at these questions. And I think you may see less than 100 vehicle configurations, but you'll probably see 100 different ways to try to get to profitability, because depending on where you're operating and the variables associated with that, there are big question marks on getting to the break-even point. So I think we're still in wait-and-see mode, and I think even if someone were to develop a model today, I'm sure that model would have limitations and maybe qualitative variables that may be missing to really drive that curve where it's supposed to be, and at what point it reaches break-even. So I think we're still in a big question mark, and will be for a little bit of time moving forward.
Yeah, I think on our side, Bell's taking the approach of we have an unmanned logistics platform. It's called APT, Autonomous Pod Transport. It's a family of vehicles. It's scalable. We have 2 flying today. One carries 55 pounds, one carries 70 pounds. So I believe that's going to be to market before the manned vehicle in our case. And what we're doing is we're going to learn from that. It will start out operating in remote areas and learning about that, and as we move it to the higher density population, not looking to be the last mile, but distribution house to distribution house, those kind of things, and learn from that all along the way, which we all need to do, and figure out what is the digital backbone of the fleet management, the maintenance, how many hours can these aircraft fly? Because a lot of operators that say are going to replace a fleet of trucks, those trucks are running all day long. These aircraft have to do the same. And in many cases, the supply chain is not what it needs to be in those areas.
Any other add-ons? All right, good. Good.
Well, I just want to make one follow-up point that is somewhat related to what you all just heard. Going back to Fullerton, two of the most important stakeholders, I think, that should be at the table as you formulate the business case for the city and region are going to be the operators themselves, those Part 135 operators probably that have the interest to be first adopters and who can put their operational experience on the table so that they can take comfort from the public who are going to look at their safety record, et cetera. And the other is investors, those who would be willing to finance the construction of new vertiports, the airport facilities, et cetera. You'd be surprised how open cities and counties and states and so forth are when you're bringing capital to the table. Instead of having a handout all the time, being able to show that there's a private sector initiative willing to pick up the tab.
Question?
So I'm a little nervous addressing you guys. Those chairs are so nice. It's like the heads of the Five family or something. I'm Scott Tindesand. My regular jobs, I'm a helicopter test pilot for Boeing, but I've been lucky enough to be part of the Boeing Next program, and I was actually the project pilot for the cargo air vehicle, if any of you have heard of that. So I feel like I'm really loud right now. Is it blaring, everybody?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
It's feeding back to me. I think my Uber friend might be able to answer this best. So I really hope all of this stuff happens before I retire, because I'm kind of involved in it, and it's really exciting. I know the NASA market survey said that we might have last mile, and we might have air taxi by 2030, and I'm hearing in 36 months versus 10 years. No digs on the FAA. In fact, thanks to your UAS integration team, our CAV project, used you guys a lot. Thank you. Look how long it took us to get, and we're still not done rolling out the ACS from the PTS, for example. ADSB, it came out as a law 10 years ago. We still have people hiccuping a decade later trying to get up to par. I think airspace is going to be a huge issue. We've got see and avoid, we've got beyond line of sight issues. Just to fly the CAV, the frequency allocation, the airspace, the MITO involvement with the aircraft certificate, the training that had to go involved, and then get the NOTAM in place, and all these pieces to test in a remote, farmyard in Texas. To think in 3 years we can have potentially last mile delivery, for example, is it pie in the sky, or are we able to accelerate the government integration with the civil sector and actually make this happen?
Yeah, look, a bunch of great questions. And first of all, huge fans of Boeing, who are one of our partners with the acquisition of Aurora Flight Sciences and have been working with the Next team as well as the Aurora team for years. And so a bunch of really great questions in there. The short answer is, look, the only thing that I know for certain is if we say it's going to take till 2030, it's definitely not going to happen before then. And so our expectation is that we can start as soon as 2023 without a lot of regulatory change, and particularly on the airspace with existing airspace procedures today. So we expect that the first several dozen aircraft won't require a bunch of the things that you mentioned, because they will have commercially rated rotorcraft pilots. They'll fly under visual flight rules in existing VFR corridors today, right? And we don't need any magic, to your point, Jay, or anything crazy. Now, in parallel, we do believe that over time, as the density of the airspace increases, that is a very complex problem, right? We're talking today, there are about 43,000 flights per day in the National Air Traffic System, about 5,000 aircraft. We're talking about squeezing about the same amount of flight activity, maybe more, in a single metropolitan area. But that is, decades away, but we are starting to work on it. So we've hired a gentleman named Tom Prevost. Tom worked on UTM technologies at NASA for over 20 years. And so Tom has built a team within Uber, is of course working closely with the FAA in the integration pilot program today. And so we have been working on UAS systems in San Diego to deliver small packages for our Uber Eats business. And that's where we're doing a lot of the work around airspace automation, building out a UTM system that not only safely can command our aircraft, but also integrate into existing air traffic. And so we continue to invest heavily into that program. We don't need it to get started for our manned aircraft and for Uber Air 2023, but over time, we expect that the learnings from that UAS delivery will fold into person transportation as well.
Okay, so you used an acronym, so I was going to ask Jay if he would define that acronym, tell us if it's being successful.
Which one?
IPP?
Oh, Integration Pilot Program? Yes, it is being successful.
What is it?
Oh, I'm sorry. I did refer to it earlier, and that is the initiative started by President Trump and Secretary Chow to identify locations, state, local, and tribal, where we could really experiment not just with technology and operations, but community integration. So it was a 3-year program. We're in the third of the 3 years. It will terminate at the end of October per the presidential directive and the legislation. But the truth is, the work's not done completely. So we're starting to work with our state, local, tribal partners and their partners that they partner with to identify what are those next things around the small UAS mission and, to a certain extent, the large UAS mission. I think people sometimes forget that in Alaska and North Dakota, we're already operating quite large aircraft and moving to larger and larger aircraft. And so my response to the reality of 2023 is slightly different. It really doesn't matter to me when it happens. Two things matter. From my regulator's standpoint, that we're doing it safely, right? So it doesn't happen until we're doing it safely, and I think to your point, Travis, no one wants to rush it and then set the industry back, yep. Right? The second piece that matters from my organization and my role in the FAA as the integration office is to be ready, not just as the regulator, but the air navigation service provider. And I'll tell you, if we're not thinking about it, if we're not prodding people to start early operations and come in, we don't identify the friction points that'll keep us from growing. That is probably the most valuable piece we're learning right now. I've said that a couple times. Maybe I should sit and decide which is the most valuable, but it's very important that we're identifying the friction points. Mm-hmm. I was on a telcon this morning where we were identifying that our response to our Federal Advisory Committee, the Drone Advisory Committee, we were not sending back responses that sounded like we were really engaged. Okay, that told me exactly who in the FAA to go talk to make sure they're on the program, right?
Right.
But it's not to go talk to them bad FAA-er. It's to tell them, this is where we need to shift. This is where we need to pivot. This is where we need to meet this industry. And I think having a regulator that has realized that we have to transform ourselves culturally to start doing this is a very important shift here for the United States.
So you used the word culture, and the reason I kind of picked on Jay a little bit with the IPP is because I was involved on the other side when I was working for the FAA. It was my team working with...
Yeah, he was the friction point.
So you're all done. You're fixed now.
No. You weren't the friction point, but well, and my staff contributes to some of the dysfunction as well.
But I was going to talk about the telecons, where you have a telecon and you just walk through some basics of the, you're seeing past each other on what you're trying to get done. And what we had tried to do with the two 135 certificated UAS was that just talking about writing the operation as we go along with the two experts, what the rulemaker need and what industry was trying to do, and just coming to the common ground to satisfy both is, I think, how we got through there.
Yep, absolutely. And the breakthrough prior to starting that work was realizing that we could with innovation and creative thinking, use our existing regulations. So your team was expert at identifying what in the regulation is very prescriptive. And the example we've used many times are the manuals.
The manuals, I used it today.
Yeah, and of course we could have digitized them and put them on the bird, but that absolutely does not meet the safety objective. So that team was expert at deconstructing our prescriptive rules and understanding what was the safety objective behind manuals, and is this operator meeting it? So while I teased you a little bit about being the friction point, you are really the enabler of a lot of this.
So thank you for that. And so I go over, when you're talking about a rotor, what that pilot is going to be, because one of the things I was pushing back on in the FAA was that, as soon as some of the ASIs saw these vehicles, their job is to safety, safety, safety. There's nothing else in their mind other than safety. So you see a vehicle that's got 8 electric motors on it, and already, okay, now you need a multi-engine rating to fly that vehicle because it's got multi-engines on it. And trying to just walk past that of, okay, what does the pilot actually have as far as the capability to do anything with one of those electric motors when it fails? Because most of the stuff is going to be so automated. And I think you used the word, Jay, what is the interaction, or somebody used the interaction of that pilot. If the pilot only has certain access in there, I'm hoping that the FAA stays out of the qualifications of the pilot to either say a commercial pilot, rotorcraft, or airplane, because what we're having right now is they're trying, I think Aircraft Cert is doing their best to put some of these future vehicles into the airplane category, even though they got vertical takeoff and landing, because they're trying to fit it into the rules. And we got to be careful with the precedents that's setting further down the road. So I just hope that some of that stuff, especially on the pilot qualifications, depending on what he has to do in there, not to over-regulate it, because I'm concerned that every vehicle is going to become a type rating, like back in the old days with helicopters, where every helicopter had a type rating and you had to take so many check rides if you had multiple aircraft in your fleet. So just something to think about.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I wanted to just back up what Jay said and give FAA a bit of a nod. I have an opportunity to work with a number of divisions within Airbus, and one of the divisions I get a chance to work with is Airbus Aerial. And we're part of the IPP program up in North Dakota, and received one of the first beyond line of sight operations over people without a visual observer in a populated area. And that was hard work. Jay used the right word and said friction. And I think when we hear timelines, it scares me a bit, because I think, or makes me pause a bit even, and I would say this internally with my own company, is because, we may be missing some procedural things or some things that may happen in the process that may delay that timeline. I think there were a few of us in this room who were a part of the Aviation Rulemaking Committee on Remote ID and Tracking, and I think if you would have asked Chris and Matt, who are in the audience, when we would get this done, even the FAA potentially, it may have been a lot earlier than when the rule actually came out. And there was probably a lot that people can speculate about that was going on in government that delayed that rule, but the point was there was a lot going on. And one of the aspects is there was a stakeholder contingent that I think the U.S. security community broadly defined that was really in the thick of that discussion. There were also probably some procedural things on questions related to tracking. There were probably some additional authorities and powers needed by the government in order to resolve those sorts of conflicts. But the point is there was friction there, and there was a ton of unknowns that moved the timeline. And so I think, going back to my earlier point, when you're envisioning the future, there's probably going to be some give and some get in some of our timelines, because this is a tough problem. And even I think that's one of the big lessons from the IPP, is that it's hard for us to get to a point where we're all working together and where we're doing something fairly innovative, even if it is pushing the envelope and even if we are learning a lot from it. So I think we're going to have to, I'm all about being really intentional about what we're up to and getting there quick and fast. But moving fast and breaking things is probably not the right sort of perspective we have, and not suggesting anyone has that perspective, but just a caution based on what's already going on in in the UAS space, we're already seeing that some of the timelines that we envision, and I can even mention NextGen, some of the timelines envisioned in the implementation of that technology weren't held up by things that we could see, but were held up by things that we didn't expect. And it may be stopping the implementation of the technology and delaying, as I mentioned, some of the timelines that we can expect. So a caution from what we see happening even right now.
Tony.
Hey, Jim. You kind of teed me up here a second ago. So a lot of challenges, right? Airspace, pilot qualifications, and everything like that. Getting some feedback. So I want to go back to the air vehicle a little bit. You know, lightweight, carry hit on the parts and pieces and everyday usage. What far part, I know there's been discussions on this. Oh, I'm sorry, Tony Randall from Bell. Thanks, Jim, I forgot to introduce myself. I run the costs, and I also have the system safety aspect of some of the certification stuff that we do. So I'm familiar with the certification process, and I know there's been discussions, Part 27 is kind of onerous with the 10 to the -9th that we're looking at and trying to prove that out, and you want lightweight vehicles, so you don't want dual redundancy if you can afford it, because then it ruins the weight of your aircraft and everything that goes with it. So, and then if you go IFR and night, which I'm sure you're going to want because you need that in all weather, what are we looking at, and where are those discussions right now with the regulators on how we're going to move forward to actually building an air vehicle that is certifiable and still able to do the job?
I'll give you the way out.
Yeah.
Really?
Thank you. 'Cause
It depends.
yeah.
Oh, man, I was going to say, make sure we got this on tape.
So to be fair to Bell and to Airbus, and while I'm not the expert, so I wish Dr. Romanowski was on the panel to answer that specific question. But my observation of this community, there are so many variables going into the aircraft design and the mission it's designed for. It's very hard to make blanket statements about the parts that they come under. That's my observation. And so it does, and I've heard Mike Romanowski, the Director of Policy and Innovation in Aircraft Cert, say this over and over again. That's why you need to come and talk to us, and you need to come and talk to us early, so we can all start working on this together and figure it out together.
Yep.
And then sort of just after talking to Aircraft Cert, we've now changed our internal processes that we start bringing in flight standards, and we start bringing in air traffic to make sure they're not left behind, because there are often many questions coming out of the design that we need to have those components, either the regulatory side or the air navigation service provider, in those discussions, so we all know that we're charting a path that actually ends up in an aircraft that can not only be certified, but it can be operated.
Good answer.
Yeah, agreed. It's a very complex, you're bringing a lot of new technologies that, I would say the regulations don't exactly address today. And you bring, and I'll just use the Part 23, Part 27, okay? I think there's a lot of us that, as we sort of analyze Part 23 and Part 27, and we say, what aspects of this, what parts of Part 23 can we go with, and what parts of Part 27? Because it's not cleanly either one of them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the real work that has to be done, is to decide how are we going to do this, and different form factors of vehicles are actually going to have different cert bases, and it's so there's a lot of change of how that's going to be done. It's not going to be one size fits all, but we do have to address the common areas against them, distributed electric propulsion and high voltage, and some things that we haven't walked into the FAA's office with yet to say how we want to test this, how are we going to show compliance, show the reliability, show the safety.
All right, how are we doing? I got a question right here. Beautiful.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Daniel, and I operate one of North America's biggest vertiports in Chicago. And my question to you guys, anyone, there was a comment earlier about stakeholders, identifying investors willing to invest in infrastructure. and even gathering these Part 135 operators and getting them to be those early adopters. So my question is, once we've accomplished this, or we feel that we're at 80, 90% there, how can we help you, specifically with identifying the, what did you guys call it, the friction, right? And even dealing with the community, which is something we're currently doing. I want to know that I'm also contributing to this, and my team is. So how can we help you, whether we're a vertiport or a small airport? Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And what I'll say is the folks sitting right next to you are part of our infrastructure team at Uber. And one of the things that we've started thinking about is, look, we're really focused on our launch markets for now, right? Los Angeles, Melbourne, Dallas. But obviously, Uber operates in over 600 cities around the world. And one of the things that we've started thinking about is how do we prepare infrastructure owners around the country and around the world, people who own small airports, people who own vertiports, whether they're small helipads or large vertiports like yourself. And so one of the efforts that we've undertaken is how do we put together what we're calling our Skyport requirements. So just like we did on the vehicle side, how do we develop a comprehensive understanding with the FAA, with the STM, with all the aircraft manufacturers, and with our Part 135 operators that we're already working with today to say, hey, here's what's necessary in a Skyport, here's how that interacts with the FAA circulars around governance for heliports and helipads today, and how can infrastructure owners prepare? And a big piece of that is going to be community engagement. And frankly, we're starting to learn now. We're starting to engage closely in New York for our Uber Copter product, in Los Angeles and Dallas and Melbourne as well. And so we're starting to get smart on that ourselves, where those friction points are, and how do you engage with the community in a way that's really effective, that talks about the benefits we're going to bring to the city. So we'd love to start the dialogue and keep it going.
I think we're really familiar with concept of operations, but there's also OpsCon, looking at the larger picture and the drivers behind that larger picture. And as we design, just like as we design a vehicle, we gather requirements. And I think Nikhil used the right word, requirements. But I think those requirements are much broader than infrastructure and the vehicle. I think you're gonna have requirements around security. I think you're gonna have community requirements. Setting aside infrastructure, for anyone in this room that's ever worked on zoning in relation to infrastructure, that's something that takes a lot longer than sometimes designing the infrastructure itself, depending on where you are in the world. And there are some places in the world where that's not even an issue, where that can get changed in weeks, not in years. So I think, to Nikhil's point, the requirements are city-specific, but they also should be really broader than the current stakeholders that come to mind. What are the insurance requirements? What are the requirements around investments? Because I know we're really big companies, but I'm sure we won't be the only ones investing in the infrastructure that we land on and take off on, because that's a big spend. It's a multi-year investment. It's something that's going to require more than just us, may require the public sector in that city. So I think what can be done, and I hope what most manufacturers and operators will do, is start to really gather the requirements necessary to launch the space. And as I alluded to earlier, we looked at a ton of the efforts written about in this space, and there was a huge gap. The window of some of these papers are 20 years, 30 years, 15 years. But if we talk about right now, between 2020 to 2025, there's a lot that can be done. And some cities like Los Angeles and Dallas and others, and some states like North Carolina are leaning into some of these questions and requirements, but there are lots of things that we must do to build the whole picture, to not just design the vehicle, but design what the business looks like. And if not, I think we're going to find ourselves in a situation where we have some scale, but we're stopped because we can't solve the challenges in these areas, whether they be infrastructure from a security perspective, so forth and so on. So I appreciate the question, and I encourage all of us to do the hard work of gathering those requirements, not just on the vehicle, but more broader than that.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
It's about communicating. I mean, we have to talk to each other, and the more consistent these policies and procedures are, the faster we can get it there. Yeah. If every city, municipality is going to do this in a different way, then there's a lot more conversation that has to be had on the individual basis, and having consistency across those policies with the smaller airports, for example, that would be a big help towards moving this ecosystem forward.
So I just want to make 2 points in relation to this conversation. One is that the last thing I would recommend anybody do is attack an urban center, the core of a city, as your first sort of milestone. If you look at cities like London or New York, there are so many opportunities for verta pairs to be connected up. The one example I use for London is Cambridge to Oxford. These are two cities that are college towns, obviously, about 70 miles apart as the crow flies, but 2 to 2.5 hours one way, whether you're driving your car or you're taking public transport. London, Greater London, without even going into the city, has maybe 30 or 40 examples like that. There are about 400 people a day that go between those two universities. So you can prove out concepts without necessarily taking on the resistance that you're going to find in the urban centers. My second point is that we as a community of a technical community and a transportation planning community, we have wonderful tools with which to use big data analytics and build simulations of airspace above cities and above regions where we can visually demonstrate from any point on the ground what a noise signature might look like, or what optical views are going to be created through denser flight operations and populations. And I would suggest that we're going to enter, we already are, we're involved in a couple of city programs right now where the airspace design is what's happening next. So analytics and the visualization tools that we have can help inform the public and take these ideas that we have into a space where we can have really sensible conversations with the public and with public officials, et cetera.
Good afternoon. I'm Greg Deeds. I just want to ask a few questions. Good to see you all, and thank you. Related to this not really being a software problem, but being a human and trust problem, what can we do in the near term to embrace cargo and some things that people can see working, carrying 1,000 pounds, no problem? I think we learned this week with the helicopter with superstar Kobe Bryant went down that bad news travels faster. So as an impact, what can we do to improve safety and the mindsets of our citizenry by demonstrating that cargo is a first leap, a orbital versus going to the moon step? And what can, the two big builders here of great aircraft tell me about that? Thank you.
So I would say what we have to do, is we have to demonstrate the reliability, the safety of moving cargo in the non-populated areas. We have to build the statistics that says these vehicles operate reliably. There are systems in place to monitor the health of the vehicle, systems in place to see that the vehicle is getting the proper maintenance. And in my opinion, we've got to do that, I'm not going to say out of the public eye, but in a smaller public. And then once you have that information, and you're going to adjust the design, the way you operate based on that, and then you can move it into the higher populated areas.
Yeah, I'll say I kind of cringe when I hear the word public acceptance because I'm a concrete guy. I don't know what you mean by public, and I don't know what you mean by accept. I don't know if you mean everyone. I don't know if you mean people in the state of Maryland or the state of California. I don't know if you mean people fully love UAM or they want to utilize UAM. So I try internally to use the word influencer acceptance. And you're spot on. It is a more scoped acceptance problem that we have. And to answer your question, Greg, which is a good one, I think we have to leverage what's going on right now. And I think we have to show the reliability of that technology to the people who matter near term. Because again, at some point, we're going to have to deal with this acceptance problem, but if we look at any adoption curve, the early influencers, or in my respect, the early people who influence the outcome of the technology, in my opinion, are the most important right now. The regulators, from a state and local perspective, we know that the noise complaints come from a very few people who are driving the complaint structure in many of these cities. And so, to be honest, you don't have a broad noise problem, you have a noise problem with a smaller group of people. So I think it's really important for us to scope as an industry, the public acceptance problem, and I think it's more of a community acceptance depending on where you are. But I can't scope this broader public acceptance problem because it really, I don't know what the finish line for that looks like over the next 5 years. So I think it's really important to leverage pilot programs. We know that whether we're talking about transportation technology implementation, or we're talking about other technology the technology in our pockets, this had an acceptance problem. I remember going to the movie theater and the movie theaters were scared of me pulling this out because they thought that my phone that, lasted, 20 minutes in battery could capture an hour-and-a-half long movie. That was an acceptance problem from an industry perspective. But now, I don't think they care about phones being in movie theaters. It's now changed that people understand the value of this, and it's really in everyone's pocket, so people really intimately see the value of it. But at the early stage, there were constituencies that we could name in detail that were more important to us getting influence over than this broader context of the public. So I think encouraging us to really scope this problem well as an industry would be wise, and I think leaning in on whether it's the IPP, the UPP, the NASA Grand Challenge, UAM Grand Challenge, these are pilot programs are vehicles that we know work really, really well to get people to accept this technology. And the bad stuff, I don't think we can do anything about. I think there are a lot of smart people in this room, and we know the math is going to lead us to the fact that bad things are going to happen, and we just have to be prepared with good stories and good examples of when this technology works. So thanks for the question, Greg.
Yeah. Got another question over here.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Tim Poisson. The firm I work with, we develop heliports. We've designed and permitted over 400 heliports across the country. And recently, we found that some sort of forward-thinking developers, real estate investors, whatnot, are interested in what all of you guys are doing, and they want to be able to accommodate these aircraft. So one of the stumbling blocks that we've had is we don't have any design, performance, weight, firefighting requirements, lighting, all that kind of stuff. And I know that's a big question, and some of this is still in development, but do you have any general specs that are available that we can kind of go back to the clients with and say, hey, if you want to accommodate an Uber aircraft, this is what we're going to be working with?
Well, that's exactly what our infrastructure team is working on. And so obviously we've heard from, at this point, probably dozens, if not hundreds of real estate developers around the world who say, listen, I want a skyport at my mall, my hotel, my multi-use facility. And we've partnered with several of them, right? Related Companies, which has built Hudson Yards, one of the most ambitious projects in Manhattan, and is building similar projects in Santa Clara and other cities around the world. Macquarie, Oak Tree's Transportation Infrastructure Fund, Hillwood, in North Texas. We're already working with a handful of real estate developers, financiers, and FBO operators who want to be in this space. And what we're doing in the process is putting together all of the things you mentioned, all the things that Travis mentioned, which is a holistic sense of what is the concept of operations going to be at Skyport Infrastructure, all the way out to what are the designs going to require, what's going to be required from a regulatory perspective, what's going to be required from an electrification perspective in order to quickly and safely charge these aircraft. So we're building this internally. We're sharing it close hold right now. We'd love to get together with you, and we'd be, of course, more than happy to share the way that we're thinking about it. And as we proceed, right, I expect that we'll have a wider public audience for those set of documents. A lot of the designs are public. We partnered with over a dozen architectural firms who work on everything from small kind of helipads to really large urban mobility hubs. And we've published a lot of those designs to get real estate firms, real estate owners thinking about what these skyports look like. So we'd love to talk to you. Just email us or find our team right over here, and let's get it started.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
All right, we had all great questions this afternoon, and I think you have another one right here? Yes, please do.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Richards with Burbank Transportation Commission. I want to play a little devil's advocate here. It seems to me that electric airplanes, which are also in development, seem to have a faster path, easier path towards certification and implementation. Here in Southern California, we have over 24 municipal and major airports that these aircraft can already operate on. No requirements for additional infrastructure investments and everything that goes with the building of those out to get the more refined, the more dense service areas that you would need with VTOL. Are you concerned with electric aircraft kind of eating your lunch in this business model in the near term?
Not at all. I mean, look, we are huge supporters of the probably dozen or so concepts that are building electric standard takeoff and landing aircraft, but you do have to remember that Los Angeles is a bit of an anomaly, right? There are 24 existing airports, and we're excited to work with as many of them kind of that fit in with our demand profile of our riders, but that's not going to be sufficient in every city around the world. And so the approach that we've taken is thinking about this in a global fashion and saying, hey, what is the aircraft that is going to be able to transport a large percentage of our rider base? We're rooting on standard takeoff and landing aircraft manufacturers who are also building what I think will ultimately be a great way to take people from A to B in cities as well. But we're focused on VTOL for thinking about what can be a large double-digit percentage of our rider base. And I think all of it is going to help promote a lot of the things we're talking about, right? Urban transportation, community acceptance, and furthering electric batteries that are safe and reliable for aircraft.
Yeah, I think we would definitely agree that that's going to help the pieces of a technology that we all want to see, the batteries, electric motors, the solid-state switches. We're all bringing in the vertical piece, and that's a different mission than this small airport to small airport necessarily. Obviously, we can encroach on that from a vertical standpoint, but I think it's all goodness that everything that you see both in the fixed wing and the vertical is going to do nothing but help the technology, help understanding the needs of batteries, what we do with batteries, all of those kinds of things. So I think it do nothing but help.
And I would add from my previous experience in my previous job, that's also going to give you a much better understanding of airspace integration. Mm-hmm. The LA Basin has some of the most densely used airspace. It also has some of the greatest underlying technology challenges associated with the air traffic management technology that's employed out here. And so seeing the impact of all of this on those technologies as well would be very useful. I once saw someone who was very enthusiastic who showed me a chart of Southern California where they were servicing with urban air mobility point to point where the demand was. Mm-hmm. And the chart was completely covered. The ink filled all of Southern California. And when I asked them, and how exactly are the aircraft going to get out of LAX and into LAX and Orange County and Ontario? And did you overlay the existing airspace structures and look at the risk associated with that? No. Mm-hmm. So I think all these, using your existing regulatory framework as I'm doing, or your existing infrastructure as you're doing, or expanding on a business model as you're doing. These are all very, very helpful techniques to, you've heard all of us say, this is about an ecosystem approach. Mm-hmm. And no one of us owns this whole piece of the ecosystem. And I think we all forget that at this point, We have inherited with manned aviation a 100-year-old ecosystem that is quite mature. And we're building a brand new one underneath all of that, using airspace in ways that was never used before. So anything that helps us understand that challenge, identify those friction points, and eliminate them, I think is helpful.
Yeah, and I'll play devil's advocate with you. I think the other driver that you'll see is a true concern around the world about emissions, whether that be in Europe or here in the United States. And I think we as a company broadly define, whether it's from the commercial aspect all the way down to urban air mobility, we've doubled down on this commitment to make our aircraft more efficient. That's the other driver that I think you'll see that will change the speed at which what happens first in the urban environment, what happens concurrently, what happens on the back end of some of this stuff, is people's desire to really make their environments and the technology that operates in those environments more efficient. So I'll echo and use a slang phrase, it's all good. I think it's all good, and I think you have other drivers that push exactly what you're articulating.
All right, so we're going to start wrapping up. We got our last question.
Great. Hey guys, how you doing? My name's Tyler. I work for a Part 135 operator in the New York area. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with Caroline Maloney's overarching bill that would ban non-essential helicopters over the New York area, the 5 boroughs, and its waterways, which would essentially eliminate UAM, any tourism, sightseeing flights in the New York area. Curious what Uber, Airbus, and Bell are doing to mitigate some of these overarching policies that would essentially end the industry in the New York area.
Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Go ahead, Nikhil.
No, so look, as you alluded to, we are running an operation in New York, Uber Copter, with existing rotorcraft. The first is just a paramount focus on safety. So to run Uber Copter, we've partnered with HELI-Flight, a prominent Part 135 in New York, and we picked HELI-Flight primarily because of safety. HELI-Flight's been operating for 19 years, 40,000 hours, accident-free, dual engine, twin pilots, Argus Platinum Plus rating. They are committed to safety, and that was our kind of number one thing going into it. So I think number one is building an operation that is fundamentally really safe. And then two, starting to work, as we've all talked about and heard today, work really closely with the community. And we're building a service that is ultimately saving people time. It's doing it in a limited capacity to begin testing and learning, working closely with the FAA, working closely with the city to build a service that ultimately a large portion of our riders love. And so we're going to start there, and we're going to continue operating safely. We're going to continue learning from our community, and those learnings, I think, are going to go directly fold into what we're building with Uber Air.
Yeah. I think this is a blind spot for the industry because this issue will come up more and more as we start to scale, as we see what we've seen this week. I think you'll have calls for all sorts of things. I think when I was at Google in 2014, 2015, 2016, there were hundreds of bills, 300, 400, almost got to 500 municipal, state, local bills trying to stop and ban the flights of small UAS, broadly defined. Now, whether or not they had that power, that's another discussion. But we quickly, as an industry, had to figure out, is this a real risk? And we agreed it was a real risk. And I think if I'm a betting man, I can bet that we'll see some of that when we talk about urban air mobility. So there's something that the industry has to be poised to address. I remember being on the phone with one of the state legislators that was introducing a bill to ban SUAS flights in her state. And she was telling me about what her issues were, and I started to think about, well, the problem you have doesn't fit the legislation that was just introduced. The legislation that was introduced wouldn't solve the problem that you're trying to solve. So I think it's really important for legislators and cities to really figure out, what are you trying to stop? Yep. Are you trying to eliminate a market, or are you trying to make the market more safe so that problems don't surface and arise? And if so, what else can we address? What other levers can we pull with the FAA or others to really address those problems versus going all the way to the extreme and let's ban all flights? Because those flights provide jobs. Those flights add to, Mike was talking earlier about the economic impact of this market. Those flights and those people add economic impact to the local city. And I think that's something that any legislator doesn't want to remove or eliminate. Really, they want to make that market safe. So I think it's important for us to narrow in and ask, what is the true problem that we're trying to solve? And then think about what are some alternatives to that. And industry and government have to do that together. It's something that we saw with small unmanned aircraft systems, still probably today and I think we'll see it with urban air mobility.
I think also that it's important for the industry, especially operators, to play the long game here. And I know that's hard to do when your livelihood is threatened. But the long game here is that with smart cities, good planning, a broad coalition of important stakeholders, including the operators themselves, your company, and your class of business, to persuasively make the arguments that in the long term, urban air mobility is going to decongest cities, it's going to restore economic benefits that have been taken away through congestion. It'll improve medevac. Those are arguments that will eventually, if properly articulated, win over local populations.
Yep, very well said, Mike, and hopefully that answered your question. But it's the unintended consequences, I think, is your point of when they try to fix it and they're not sure what they're fixing. So certainly as an association, we have government affairs, and we try to get involved there and round up the support of our members so that we make sure that, what is the problem we're solving, and then meet with Congress as necessary to help be on the same page at least. So I know most of the people in this room, since you're here, are interested that tomorrow morning from 9 to 11 in room 210 AB will be the Vertical Flight Society holding its 3rd annual electric VTOL panel. This year the panel complements this one. It's focused on acoustics. The panel is called Quiet eVTOL Revolution, with experts from HEI Fly Neighborhood Committee and the Vertical Flight Society, Uber, Joby, and Hyundai, tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., room 210 AB. So I want to thank you for the great questions. I want to thank the panel for the great answers. And please get out there and enjoy the show. Thanks.